Hi, we continue in Genesis 34 after Shechem has taken Dinah and lay with her and defiled her, and now gone to his father and said, "Get me this girl, or take for me this girl to be my woman." And now we see what Jacob and his son's response will be. So to situate ourselves, as you can see on the right side of the screen, we're near the end of the Jacob story here, down at the bottom. If you haven't watched the introductory video to this unit, I really encourage you to do so, where I go over a number of the issues that scholars grapple with, which we'll look at some of here as we relate to this section of our story. But there's a lot more I went over in the introductory video that I would encourage you to look at, including how what we're doing is framed by the end of chapter 33 and the beginning of chapter 35, as we've looked at on this chart of key words here, the parts that are bold underlined at the beginning matching the parts that are bold underlined at the end, to highlight that the theme is about Jacob settling too soon outside the city. And as we'll see at the end, the emphasis is on God sending a terror on the cities as an expression of protection for Jacob from the situation. So it's not about their foreignness, and it's not about Deuteronomy 7 and its demand that you kill all the people of the land or God will kill you. Genesis is a counter story to that, not a consistent story to that. So to understand that, we have to understand it in its whole narrative context, which has been anti-city, as well as its understanding of some of the relationships between the people of Yahweh and other people. So we've been going over some of these issues. Now, we went over this last time around the relation between the laws in Exodus and Deuteronomy that have to do with finding a virgin in the field and what you do for that, noting that it provided financial compensation, which the Genesis authors are plainly highlighting is not nearly good enough. Now we get to these questions. Does Shechem's love that we looked at last time, and I put it in quotes because last video I highlighted how the Hebrew word ahav does not really mean what the English word love does. It's much closer to something like lust or desire. It's also what Isaac had for the savory food that his son Esau made for him. So it's not about romantic love, and it's not even necessarily about human eros, and it's certainly not about what in the New Testament would be called agape, the love for another that is greater than your care for yourself. This is about a desire. And the question is, does his desire and a marriage proposal balance his defiling of Dinah? And scholars go back and forth all over. And the answer, I just want to say plainly, is obviously not. There's no question in their world or in ours does this balance. Whether Simeon and Levi are justified in destroying all the people of the city at the end, as we'll see, spoiler alert if you didn't know, is a separate question. But plainly, the abduction or rape, whichever way you want to see it, of this woman, and then proposing to marry her afterwards, it does not balance within the perspective of Genesis. And we don't have to impose a modern sense of ethics on that. That would certainly fit well within the story as we're seeing here. It's just a question of whether the response we see matches as well. We talked about Dinah's silence and Leah's silence last time. Today I'd like to just refer to Jacob's silence, which many scholars see as a matter of his reticence, and it might well be that, which we see in verse 5 we'll look at in a minute. But as Lynn Bechtel has pointed out often in Genesis, especially around the situation in the parallel story in many ways in the Sodom story with Lot and the visitors there, this is about group identity and not about individuals. This is about the people of this city and the people of Jacob's family, not about just Dinah individually, because people did not exist as individuals in that context. Plainly, they weren't individuals in the sense of, what do I want to do when I grow up and where do I want to live, and I'll just go off and do my own thing. They're obviously economically and socially dependent upon each other in a harsh land without all the modern conveniences that allow us to be so mobile. But in addition to that, the whole attitude of life is you are part of a group. Whether that's Israel in the later sense or Jacob's family in the more immediate sense. And for the Shechemites, it's certainly part of their family and also part of their city identity, as we'll see when, after talking to Jacob, Hamor goes out to talk to the, quote, men who meet at the gate of the city, which is to highlight all the people of the town. So it's about a group situation. What we see here, according to Bechtel, which makes sense to me, is that Jacob is waiting, as the text says, until the brothers come, his sons come, so that they can decide what to do together. But as Sternberg has pointed out, ironically, they never have that discussion, so that isn't actually what ends up happening. And we won't get to the brothers' deceitful counteroffer until next time. So looking at our key words in our frame, I noted last time the chiastic shape of this here So I didn't go over it in detail. I'll just note it a little more here. So in the A part, the very short A part, we see Shechem speaking to his father, and here we see similarly the response of Hamor and Shechem together after the conversation. In the B1 part, we see Jacob and his sons and the question of how to respond to them, and then we see the similar thing on the B prime part where the sons of Jacob answered Shechem. And in the part in the center, which we can see as one part or as parallel C parts here, Hamor makes his proposal and then Shechem makes his proposal. And they're not exactly the same, as we'll see. We'll look at this first part this time, and we'll look at the Shechem part and the other half of this next time. One of the things I was noting last time, but I didn't bring up this chart, I brought it up in the previous video, so I want to bring it up now in relation to what we looked at last time, but also here, of how much Genesis 34 is linking to earlier scenes in Genesis. And that's not just a random element, and we're at the end of the Jacob cycle. And so it's not only bringing things forward from earlier in the Jacob cycle, it's bringing things forward not only from the whole patriarchal cycle, but from all the way back to the Garden of Eden and the building of the first city from Cain. And we saw last time the echo of the Garden of Eden with the word for how Shechem is drawn to Dinah being the same word for clinging of a man to his woman in that context there. So while I have this up, we can see he loved the girl, Nahara, we looked at last time, and that's 5 times in Genesis 24 around Abraham's servant looking for the wife for Isaac, which of course turns out to be Rebekah, and not anywhere else in Genesis. In today's scene that we'll see here in verse 7, we hear the men were indignant, using this unpronounceable word without the vowels, but it's only 2 other times in Genesis, and one is that Yahweh, sorry that God had made humankind, and only here in the Joseph story, which we'll look at when we get there. And then finally, today we'll see how the proposal is, you shall live with us and your land shall be the land shall be toward your faces, and echoing Abram talking to Lot in chapter 13, is not the whole land before your face. And that highlights that as much of this story is about land as it is about marriage and women, which highlights not only the rape parallels that we looked at last time, both and the time before, not only the ones between Shechem and Dinah here and Amnon and Tamar there, which start off the same way as we see here, but then go a very different way down here, and with the situation with Bathsheba and Uriah and David that we looked at some there, and we'll see more of that next time when we get to the response. But also not to a rape story, but to a land acquisition story here, where Abraham speaks with the Hittites about a woman who's in need of something, his dead wife Sarah, and here Jacob is speaking with the Hivites about his daughter Dinah, who's ritually dead in that sense. And we see they both speak to all who went in at the gate of the city. And today the question of sharing the land is at issue, and there's a question of price, not the price for the land here, the price for Dinah that Shechem offers, but also the use of mention of merchants and traders, which is only in these places. So it's as much about land as anything else, which goes to the theme that will be repeated by Yahweh, or not by Yahweh, by Elohim in chapter 35, the promise to Abraham, promised again to Jacob about the land. And one of the themes we've been looking at throughout is Yahweh or Elohim has promised the land, but how are they supposed to get it given the other people are there? And as we saw in Genesis 23, one of the ways was to buy it from them. This could potentially be another way to negotiate marriage alliances, and if they hadn't defiled Dinah, perhaps that would have happened, but it's not what happens. One of the things that's certainly not what happens here is what is directed in Deuteronomy, or in books of Joshua, which is a partner to Deuteronomy, which is to make war on all these people and try to destroy them. Instead, Genesis' strategy has largely been to stay away from them, and that was exactly Jacob's mistake here. Perhaps exhausted from his getting away from Laban and getting away from Esau, now he's settled too soon, not fulfilling Yahweh's command to go back to either Beersheba, where he started, or as he'll be told in chapter 35, to Bethel, where their relationship began in chapter 28 in Genesis. And so we have the situation we have here, which means that no matter how closely we look at the language of negotiation, there's no good outcome here. And that's going to be quite clear from Hamor and Shechem's speech in the beginning, because they say nothing at all about how Shechem got a hold of Dinah. In fact, they make it sound like they don't have her yet. So with no further ado, let's put up the key words here and enter into our passage, starting here in verse 5. So, as my note below has, Jacob's non-response is interposed between Shechem's demand of his own father and Hamor's response in verse 6. Thus, the story is as much about children demanding of parents based on their own perceived needs, Shechem for the quote-unquote girl, and Jacob's sons for revenge and honor, as it is about the gender relations themselves. And as Wenham notes below, Jacob's indifference to his Leah's daughter's humiliation here stands in sharp contrast to his passionate attachment to Joseph and Benjamin, the sons of Rachel. We've already seen that once, and we'll see it again with the birth of Benjamin. And this is where Bechtel notes exactly what I said, so I don't need to get in detail. I've already summarized that. So Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, and the first thing we have to ask is, how does he know? We hear in the same sentence, his sons were with the cattle in the field, and we hear in verse 7 that they're just coming in from the field. So he didn't hear it from them, and as we find out later, Shechem already has a hold of Dinah in his house, and so he didn't hear it from Dinah, so who would he have heard it from? I noted last time that although Leah is not mentioned and Rachel's not mentioned here and Dinah is silent, they're certainly present, so perhaps he heard it from Leah or Rachel. And we also know that Deborah is there, who's his mother Rebecca's nurse, and so perhaps there's a whole entourage of people. It wouldn't be surprising that we don't hear named, but however he heard of it, somebody knew and told him. And what they tell him is defiled, using time here, which is not the same word as inah, which is the word that could be translated as by force or by defilement or disgrace, a similar word. And it's only these 3 times in Genesis, although it's 162 times in the Hebrew scripture, 52 times in the PL stem, which is what it is here. And as Sternberg notes, the meaning goes even beyond the emotive abused, implying moral and religious outrage. And Bechtel argues that this is because of the outside stuff, not the rape, that Shechem is an uncircumcised, impure outsider. And that may well be the case, but I think I'd suggest it's ambiguous here. It depends on what exactly he had been told. He doesn't necessarily know the whole story yet. But his sons are out there with the cattle in the field. We've seen the field mentioned a couple times. It's the field that we are already told that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor. And so Jacob held his peace until they come, using the word cheresh here in the Hiphil stem, as noted from Sternberg again, often has the pejorative connotations of inertness or neglect. At this point, as my note continues, it is unclear whether he is waiting to call a family emergency meeting or is feeling powerless to respond to the outrage in the face of his land relationship to Hamor. And as my note below has, Sternberg noting the parallel, apart from Jacob's lack of action, more shocking is his lack of emotional response of the rape of the daughter in comparison with David about the rape of his daughter Tamar in 2 Samuel 13. Until they came, which as Sternberg notes the comment I made earlier, that even after they come, it's not really going to change Jacob's behavior much. And I'd like to suggest that's because there's no right answer. What would we have him do at this point? What do you think Dinah would have him do at this point? We simply don't know. And so Hamor, the father of Shechem, in case we hadn't remembered that, and it's interesting that we were told last time that Shechem was the chief in the city, but Hamor is his father, so he goes out, perhaps not so much because Shechem can't speak for himself, he will speak for himself in just a few more verses, but because he's vouching for him there, father to father. So he went out, matching exactly what Dinah did going out. She went out to the women of the land, and he goes out to speak to Jacob. And of course, for sexist interpreters who criticize Dinah for going out, like suggesting that women who wear provocative clothes are asking to be raped, it's tragic to hear that in modern commentaries, but sometimes you still do. Notice that Hamor goes out in exactly the same way, and nobody would suggest anything untoward about him. So he goes to Jacob to speak with him, father to father. No sense of speaking to the sons here. The fathers will speak about the sons and their children. And as is noted here, the just as here is ambiguous. Sternberg again highlights the fact that we can read this 2 ways, sequentially or simultaneously. He notes on the sequential reading, there's a plot link between verse 6 here, speak with him, and verse 8, spoke with him down here. Suggesting they tried Jacob first, but in the face of his silence, tried again with his sons. So that would make this sequential. But if they're simultaneous, it produces an impression of busy activity on all sides. Only Jacob, on whom all eyes are fastened and all movements converge, holds his peace. And the ambiguity of the language there is just part of the overall picture I've been trying to portray throughout, that against scholars' attempt to disambiguate the story and decide, is it rape or not, is the behavior justified or not, it's purposely ambiguous all the way to the bottom. And that's exactly the point, that they're in a situation of ambiguity that can only be resolved by going back to the fork in the road and going a different direction. So when they heard of it, we don't know how they heard of it, whether Jacob told, but notice the parallel. Jacob heard of it, and now they heard of it, both in the passive there. The men, now they're described as unashamed. They went from sons here to men, highlighting not only they're adults, but they're responsible for themselves. They're not just as sons, they are adults on their own, and that's how they will act. And they're described in very strong language here. Indignant in the hitpael form, or grieved, as I noted earlier, for what God's view was, the violence that people had put on the earth that provoked the flood. And then as Sternberg notes, grief over the rape of their sister leads the way and anger comes second. That's possibly the situation, but we don't know if they know that she'd been raped or if she was raped. But they certainly know that what we don't know yet, that she's in Shechem's house, because she's plainly not there. And they can see that and we can't see that. So they're indignant in that sense, and also very angry, and meod being the word for intensity here. And we see anger early on. This was Cain's anger, and we see a number of them. I won't go over them all. But it's not that often there's anger there, and we saw the parallel with the parallel stories when I showed you those. And it's very clear, and the Hebrew is as clear here as the English translation. What they're indignant and angry about is because Shechem had committed an outrage in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter. Notice not with their sister, but with Jacob's daughter. It's not that he's a foreigner. It's not the question of intermarriage that's the problem. It's what they've done to her. And using nevelah here for folly or foolishness, which is how I translated it over here, as you can see, committed a folly, making it something parallel to Nabal back in 1 Samuel 25, whose name meant fool or folly, but also similar in 2 Samuel 13:12, where Tamar says to Amnon not to commit that folly, almost identical there. Notice it in Israel as if Israel was a polity, a group of people, even though at this point Israel simply refers to Jacob. And the group of people have not otherwise been known as Israel. So many scholars see this as anachronistic here, and it certainly is, not for the audience, of course, but for the characters in the story. And it's certainly for the sons of Jacob to have the perspective that in Israel, as a context in which one commit an outrage, is anachronistic. But that's okay. Whether we see that as an earlier interpolation or just the authors putting something in there that the audience would understand, we don't have to treat it as an external source, because it certainly fits the entire story as we go. And the outrage or the folly is done by lying with Jacob's daughter, which, as I want to keep underlining, whether it was rape or not, the fact that they had sex with her, even if she agreed, which is the image in the fictional version of it in Anita Diamant's popular novel decades ago, The Red Tent, where she portrays it as a love story that the brothers are jealous of and interrupt with all their violence. Even if it was consensual, the fact that he lies with her before the marriage proposal would still be an outrage, because it would force her family to say yes or have a daughter who's not good for any man again. And so it's still an outrage, even if it's a love story, either way. For such a thing ought not to be done, using the narrator's phrase probably here, but a phrase that we hear a number of times. And as Genesis Rabbah notes below, even among the nations, because after the world had been smitten in the generation of the flood, they arose and eschewed immorality. In this case, having sex outside of a marriage commitment here. And it's not that they're prudish about it, it's about what marriage was in their world so different than ours. So I won't get into all that business right now. So to continue in our passage, a couple more verses here, not but and. It's not alternating in the face of that. It's just a continuing here. And as my note below has, Hamor's smooth and conciliatory words are belied by the cover-up of the crime implicit in the offer, because that's what we hear here. We hear about his longing, but we don't hear about the cause and effect issue. So we spoke with them, the brothers only, as far as we can tell. That's what my notes suggest, but we don't know that Jacob's not listening there. The heart, or the essence, or the being, I translated it as essence here and as being elsewhere, but it's the same word, nephesh. Not translated as soul earlier and heart here, which I can't explain why the Norris V would do that, but in any event, it's nephesh, the center of your being. So the center of his being longs, using the word for desire here, only here in Genesis and 11 times in the Hebrew Scripture, parallel with Deuteronomy 21:11, which you can see here, for your daughter. Please, notice the please here, although he can afford to be polite because he knows really that Jacob can't say no. He doesn't have to know anything about any specific ethnic morality that Jacob and his family might have different than the Hivites. He would certainly know that anybody in their world whose daughter had been taken can't say, no, give her back and we'll keep her uselessly forever, although in the end that's what happens, not because it's Jacob's choice. So please give her to him. And the irony of this is deep. They're asking to give her somebody who they already have. Certainly the give in marriage is a sense of give in this special way, but the fact that she's in his home at this time can't be ignored. The phrase in marriage is literally as a woman. Make marriages is a different word we'll look at there, but literally this is just give her to him as a woman, because there's no word for wife or husband in Hebrew. So we'll go 2 more verses here. Make marriages with us, which is the proposal here to become related by marriage, a word that's almost always used otherwise for in-laws or non-spouses, explicitly prohibited in Deuteronomy 7:3. So what they're proposing at one level is exactly what Deuteronomy's against, but that's not the issue here, as I've been trying to make clear. Notice the symmetry here. Give your daughters to us. They only have the one, so there are no other daughters to give, but they don't necessarily know that. And take our daughters for yourselves, although we don't know what daughters there are there, and we haven't seen any, and we won't see any specifically, although we'll certainly hear of those who were killed at the end. But there's none that are visible in the story. So the symmetry of marriage, and then this interesting symmetry, which was not part of the original plan, but here it is. And as Wenham notes below, the offer Abraham might have wished for in chapter 23 when he's looking for the burial place. But was he? I don't know if we can say that Abraham wanted to live amongst the Hittites. He simply had the need for a place to bury Sarah. And that place, Machpelah, becomes the family tomb, and they go back to it across generations. But never is it said that they lived there. So whether he had the desire or not, it's never expressed otherwise. The term for live is misleading here because it's the key word for settle. And I noted over here a number of times, settle, 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 which you can see. And that's the point, is that you've settled too soon. This is not the place to settle, and that's exactly what they're proposing. And as we'll hear after the scene, Elohim will say, settle in Bethel. So don't settle with us and don't settle here. And they continue, and the land shall be open toward you, or literally shall be toward your face, as I noted earlier, as a parallel with the relationship of Abram telling Lot to look out across the land. Live and trade in it. So as to say, settle and trade in it. So you can go about your business here, and again, that's parallel, as we see here, to Abraham using the measure of the merchants and traders to pay for the land there, and get property in it. And the Nephal, the most valuable of the privileges offered, as Sarna notes, even is also a subtle and pointed reminder to Jacob of his present alien and disadvantaged status. And it's omitted in the report of the city elders. And that provides an interesting tension between Lot in chapter 19, who appealed to his fellow townspeople as brothers, but they said, you came here as a foreigner and you're going to tell us. And we don't know that Lot owns property, although he has a house that he and his daughters live in. And we know that Abraham got property in the Hittite territory in chapter 23, but would they want to get property here? This is the land of Canaan, as I noted on the map last time. They're in the land that is called later the land of Israel, but this is not the way to do it. So we'll pick up the other half of the chiasm next time and see how Jacob's sons have another plan in mind for how to resolve the situation. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.